I asked the waiter to hand my ring to my wife and her lover in front of everyone, while I watched from a distant table, invisible to her. The impact was silent but devastating. She looked confused, then understood, and then panic. I got up and left without her seeing me, taking with me the end of our story. And it was that night, amidst the clanging of silverware and false smiles on the faces around me, that life ceased to be the life I knew. There was something cruel in the way she laughed as her lover touched her hand, something cold in the way she turned her face away just as the waiter placed the velvet box in front of her. I saw her expression contort as if her skin were burning. She knew. In that second, she knew. Because only those who betray know the weight of being caught without words. She looked around, searching for me, but I wasn't there. Not anymore. In that moment, I was no longer her husband. I was a spectator of my own ruin, a witness to the demolition of a home built with years of dedication, in a single act of cowardice. What makes someone cross the line? What drives a person to lie while looking into the eyes of the one they swear to love? For months, I tried to find an answer that fit within logic, but all I found was emptiness. Discovering the betrayal wasn't the worst part. The worst part was remembering all the moments I trusted, when I embraced a body that was no longer mine, when I was left last in an emotional agenda where someone else occupied the center. Her silence in the last few days, the distance, the forced exhaustion, it all made sense now. But none of these signs mattered in the face of the brutality of seeing it with my own eyes. It was a clean, deep, incurable cut. There were no screams, no confrontations. There was only the muffled sound of the end. And my absence where before there had been presence. What remained of her, in that room, before the velvet box, was merely the reflection of her own choice. I left. But not without taking everything with me. All the memories, the words spoken in the dark, the promises made with ragged breaths, the plans for the future that would now turn to dust. I walked to the car with tears in my eyes and a silence in my chest. Because sometimes what screams loudest inside us is what we decide never to say out loud. I never looked back. And in the months that followed, I carried that silence like an open scar, the kind that no longer bleeds but still burns every time something touches it. I tried to forget, but you can't forget the taste of humiliation. You can learn to live with it. And it was in this forced coexistence with pain that I found another kind of love, calm, honest, with eyes that never waver. A love that made no promises and yet delivered. And in that unhurried gaze, that asked nothing of me other than to be who I was, I allowed myself to breathe again. She tried to come back. She came with swollen eyes, her voice trembling, saying it was a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she'd lost herself. She said nothing she'd experienced with him had made sense, that her lover had made her feel alive for a moment, but then quickly discarded her as something to be used and forgotten. She said what she thought was passion had turned to silence, absence, and finally, contempt. But I was no longer the one who once knelt to ask for her hand. I was someone else. And no matter how much her voice trembled, no matter how much regret dripped from her eyes, there was no longer any bridge between us. And it was in this desperate attempt to make amends that she stumbled upon the cruelest part of her own story. I had forgiven her, but not to make amends. I forgave to leave in peace. To leave her with the echo of her own choices. Because there are wounds that, even healed, carry the memory of pain in every touch. For a long time, she believed she could come back. That I would be there, on the other end of the line, waiting for the moment to say, let's try again. But betrayal doesn't just break love. It destroys respect. And without respect, there's no foundation left. She reached out to me more than once. She sent messages, letters. I read one of them with a heavy but firm heart. And it was after that letter, where she finally admitted everything, that I knew, she wasn't sorry for betraying me. She was sorry for losing someone who truly loved her. Her remorse wasn't love, it was loneliness. The pain she felt wasn't from my absence, it was from the absence of what represented security. And when someone comes back not out of love, but out of desperation, the best thing you can do is keep the door closed. One day, by chance, I found an old box. Inside, a diary I'd forgotten about. Written there were the days before the fall, my thoughts trying to understand why she was distant, my lonely outbursts in the early mornings when she said she was too tired to talk. Each page was a portrait of the man I was before I knew. But what tore me apart the most was the last entry. The day before I found out everything, I'd written, "I still believe her. I still think this is all in my head. No one who loves would be capable of hurting someone like that. And she loves me. She's just going through something difficult. I just need to be patient." That destroyed me more than the betrayal itself. Knowing that until the very end, I still believed. That my faith in her was greater than my survival instinct. That I defended her even from the possibility of being who she truly was. And perhaps that's the cruelest thing about betrayal, it doesn't just steal love, it rips away the part of us that believed in the other with all our souls. Today, she lives with the pieces of what she destroyed. I know she tries to move on, but every time we cross paths by chance, on a street, in a cafe, in some vivid memory, I see in her eyes the silent regret of someone who has lost something they will never have again. And no matter how much she tries to smile, there's always a trace of pain hidden in the corner of her mouth, as if she carries a bitter memory under her tongue. And I just move on. Without anger. Without hurt. Only with the certainty that I deserve something more. Something whole. A love that doesn't need to be monitored. A love that doesn't need to be recaptured every day as if trust were disposable. And even though she was the one who betrayed me, it was me that life rewarded. Because in the end, true love returns. Not always in the same person, but it returns. And when it returns, it comes with peace. But what she did, what she lost, no one can give back. Not time. Not tears. Not apologies. She swore he was different. That he made her feel things marriage had erased. She thought she was alive, when in reality, she was just deluded. She thought she was special to him, but she was just another one. When reality set in, cold, indifferent, definitive, he was gone. And what was left was emptiness. And then she tried to come back to me, as if no time had passed, as if I hadn't suffered. As if my silence had been merely a pause, not an end. And it was there, as she looked at me for the last time, that she knew what hurt her wasn't my absence, it was the weight of her own conscience. It was the reflection of having destroyed a true love for a fleeting illusion. A mistake she would make 1,000 times, but that forgiveness would never erase. And perhaps the most painful thing of all was this, realizing that not even the most sincere love survives those who don't know how to care. And now, what could have happened after that last reunion? What could she have seen in my eyes that made her fall apart in silence? Was she ever loved again the way I loved her? Or did she understand, too late, that some losses are forever? Only time will tell what remains when everything has been lost. But the end is yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal isn't glamorized, it's exposed. All the stories you hear are fictional, but the feelings, the wounds, and the consequences are real. Our purpose is clear, to show how one wrong choice can destroy true love, and leave scars forever. Now take a deep breath. Get ready. You are about to hear a story shocking, intense and impossible to forget. They met almost mundanely, like two strangers who cross paths every day, unaware of the impact they'll have on each other's lives. It was in a neighborhood bookstore, on an ordinary late afternoon, when the wind was already blowing leaves along the sidewalks and the sunlight was casting long shadows on the old buildings. She was sitting by the window, leafing through a romance novel, while he searched for a book he couldn't even remember the title of. When their eyes met, it was as if the noise outside had been silenced. There was no exaggerated charm, no rehearsed phrases. He simply smiled, she smiled back, and thus began a conversation that would last far beyond that day. Unlike stories that sell themselves as perfect from the first chapter, their beginning was shy, almost silent. But there was something there, a strange tranquility, as if their encounters were being carefully guided by some invisible, insistent force that knew where it would lead. His name was Daniel. He was a calm, reserved, observant man, the kind who pays attention to details others miss. He had a firm, almost unchanging routine and a slight melancholy in his eyes, like someone who had known pain but refused to hold a grudge. He worked in architecture, but seemed to live for people more than projects. He cared for his friends, called his mother every week, read more than he spoke, and yet, when he did speak, it was with surgical precision. Helena, however, was different. Intense, restless, passionate about the idea of love. She had a wide smile and a light manner, like someone who prefers to laugh rather than argue. She was a literature teacher and seemed to harbor within herself the sweetness of the stories she read and taught. But there was also a shadow within her, something hidden in silence that only revealed itself on weary days. Helena carried a past she didn't usually share, and Daniel respected that. He never pressured, never demanded. He was simply there, whole, even when she didn't say everything. Their relationship began with an exchange of glances, but it was built on routine. Simple dinners at home, series watched under the covers, notes left on the kitchen table, lingering hugs before work. There were no exaggerated promises or public declarations, just a silent pact of presence. They liked each other in the details, the subtlety, the discreet touch when crossing the street. Helena had a habit of organizing books by color, and Daniel found it amusing, even if he'd never admit it. He, on the other hand, would leave glasses around the house, and she complained every time, but laughed in the end, knowing it was part of him. Their love was simple but firm. It wasn't made of spectacle, but of constancy. And perhaps that's why it lasted so long, because it didn't demand more than the other could give. Over time, their relationship blossomed into marriage. It wasn't a movie proposal, it came naturally, one random afternoon, over a glass of wine and a conversation about the future. They decided to live together in a small but light-filled apartment, where every corner bore their mark. They painted the walls, chose the furniture, and carefully set up the bedroom. The bed was too big for the space, but they liked sleeping close together, so they didn't mind. The house became a refuge, a safe haven. It was where everything happened, the fights, the reconciliations, the late-night laughter, the serious conversations, the comfortable silences. They were two adults who had found peace in each other. And for a long time, that was enough. Daniel had always been more reserved when it came to his feelings. He expressed his love through gestures, never through speeches. He'd come home early from work to make dinner, text her to ask if she'd eaten, and show up unexpectedly with flowers even when she said she didn't care. Helena, on the other hand, was a fire. She needed to be listened to, needed to be touched, needed daily confirmation that she was still loved. Sometimes, she seemed to demand more than Daniel knew how to give, and this created small cracks in their relationship. It wasn't a lack of love, it was a difference in language. But these small cracks were gradually filled with affection, patience, and mutual effort. Until they stopped bothering her. Until they became just part of the ground they walked on together. They had mutual friends, frequented the same places, and traveled whenever they could. At each destination, they took the same photo, back to back, looking at the horizon. It was a silly tradition, but it made them smile. Daniel said he liked that image because it captured what they were, two companions looking forward, side by side. Helena found it poetic, and it made her love him even more. The years passed, but they remained close. Even when life got tough, when work consumed them, when exhaustion set in. Their love seemed intact, even on the hardest days. And that was exactly when everything began to change, not with a scream, but with a silence. Helena began to be absent. Small, almost imperceptible absences. Meetings that lasted too long, laughter on the phone in the wee hours of the morning, vacant glances in the middle of conversations. Daniel noticed, but didn't say anything. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of blind trust. He preferred to believe it was just a phase. That the world outside was demanding more of her. And as always, he respected it. She said she was tired, that she needed space. And he gave it. Because that's what love, for him, was, not suffocating. But inside, something was beginning to stir. A cold foreboding, a nameless uneasiness. The nights became quieter, dinners less frequent, hugs shorter. Still, he didn't give up. He stayed there, trying to keep a flame alive that seemed to be slowly fading, without explanation. She, in turn, lived in turmoil. Something inside her simmered silently. A restlessness, a constant doubt, a longing for something she couldn't even name. She began to look at herself in the mirror with different eyes. She wanted to feel that thrill of the unexpected again, that sensation of being seen differently. It was a confusing, contradictory feeling that made her pull away even though she wanted to stay. Helena never stopped loving Daniel, at least, that's what she told herself. But there was an emptiness growing inside her. And instead of looking at him, she preferred to lose herself outside. What she was searching for was still uncertain, but the way she began to act created shadows within the house that had once been only light. Daniel, little by little, stopped smiling with his eyes. There was a new weariness in his face, a kind of aching weight. He still watched her tenderly, still tried to get closer, but with each attempt, he seemed to be pushed further away. He began to wonder if he was being enough. If he had stopped being interesting. If, at some point, she had changed and he hadn't noticed. But still, even in the face of her coldness, he didn't give up. He kept making coffee, leaving notes, trying to strike up a conversation. He waited for her to return, for the sparkle in her eyes to return to the same state when she looked at him. But her eyes were already looking elsewhere, and he didn't know it yet. Outside, the world went on. People saw them as the perfect couple. Always in sync, always together. But inside the house, the silence was already screaming. She avoided talking about feelings, he didn't want to seem pushy. And so, day after day, they drifted apart without realizing it. Helena became absent even on weekends, often going out alone, claiming she needed to breathe. Daniel, silently, respected her. Because that's how his love was, it let her be free, even though inside she was crumbling. He began to go out less, talk less, smile less. His eyes held doubts, but his mouth still said, "It's okay." Because he believed that love went through phases, and that, in the end, the important thing was to stay. He didn't yet know that not everyone chooses to stay. What hurt Daniel most wasn't the separation. It was her absence within his own body. As if, even there, she wasn't there. The laughter, once spontaneous, was now forced. The kisses, once intense, were now cold. Her eyes, once fixed on his, now fled. And yet, he tried. He tried to understand what had changed, tried to pull her back, tried to be enough for a void that had no name. It was like loving someone who was no longer there, but insisted on staying. And he loved. He loved with all her flaws, with all his patience, with all the hope that one day she would return to her former self. But sometimes, absence isn't the beginning. It's the end that's already begun, and no one noticed. It was on a cloudy Thursday morning that Daniel realized something had broken forever, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Helena was more distant than ever, and her touch no longer carried the warmth it once did, as if her present body carried an absent, restless soul, far away. He still made coffee as he did every day, with the same care, even though the silences grew longer each morning. When she hurried downstairs, her eyes on her phone's emails, and responded with an air kiss to his gentle good morning, he didn't feel angry, he felt sorry. Sorry for her for not realizing how lost they were. Sorry for him for still trying to row alone a boat that was already taking on water on all sides. But there was something else that morning, a silent, aching certainty that he was being left behind, not by chance, but by choice. And this realization grew within him like a tide that no one could stem. As the days passed, Helena's absences became more frequent and hurriedly justified, with short sentences and eyes that no longer held his. She would leave without a set time for return, and when she returned, she brought with her a new perfume, a strange tiredness, an agitation she claimed was from work, but which Daniel knew came from elsewhere. He began to notice details he'd previously ignored, the way she smiled while looking at her phone, the messages she hid with the screen facing down, the hidden nervousness every time he asked if everything was okay. She didn't ask out of distrust, she asked out of love. But every response from her was a curt denial, as if the mere fact that he still cared was a nuisance. "It's okay, you always think there's something wrong," she would say, trying to cut off any chance of delving deeper into what was on the verge of exploding. And he, wounded, would retreat. He began to wonder if he was being paranoid, if the problem lay within him, if his insecurity wasn't a figment of his own imagination. But love, even wounded, still sees what is real. And what Daniel saw in her eyes wasn't tiredness, it was guilt. The nights became colder, not because of the temperature, but because of the absence of anyone around. Helena would arrive and go straight to the shower, avoiding conversation, avoiding contact. She lay on her back, leaving no room for his body. When he approached, she would feign a headache, claim exhaustion, close her eyes before he could even say goodnight. The room that had once been a shelter was now just a ceiling. And Daniel, once so stable, began to feel an abyss opening up inside him. He tried to distract himself with work, with friends, but even there the pain escaped. He spent his days in an almost superhuman effort to appear whole, while inside he was slowly falling apart. He even missed her flaws. He missed when she would tease him about his habit of putting socks on the couch, when she would complain about his taste in music, when they would argue about which series to watch on Sunday. Now, she was barely home on Sundays. And when she was, she seemed to hate it. It was then that, at the urging of a friend, Daniel decided to seek comfort, anything. He began running in the mornings, reading books he'd left forgotten on the shelf, listening to old songs, as if trying to reconnect with himself, with what he was before he lost himself in her silence. But nothing worked. Because nothing fills the hole of a love that empties before his eyes without explanation. It was in that moment of weakness that he considered looking at her phone. Not out of jealousy, not out of control, but out of desperation. Because he wanted to find an explanation there that her mouth didn't have the courage to give. But when he finally got the chance, when the phone vibrated next to the bed and he saw a notification from an unfamiliar name, a name he'd repeated over the past few days, he backed away. Because there was still something in Daniel that believed love needed respect even in pain. Even so, the name was engraved. And that was enough. At the end of that same week, Helena returned home later than usual. Her makeup was slightly smeared, her hair disheveled, and she had a lost look in her eyes that she tried to hide with automatic phrases. Daniel watched silently, as if he were a spectator to his own downfall. He didn't ask where she was, didn't mention that he'd been waiting for her with dinner ready. He simply said goodnight and went to sleep. The next day, she acted as if everything was fine. She made coffee, commented on the weather, and made general plans for the weekend. But Daniel could no longer pretend. The emptiness between them had become undeniable. That morning was the harbinger of the end. He left the house without saying much, and spent the entire day with a feeling of nausea, of something about to be confirmed. Confirmations began to arrive in small details, a different scarf, a poorly worded apology, a hastily disconnected call. But it was one afternoon that everything changed. Helena had said she would be attending a training course, something related to the school where she worked. Daniel, coincidentally, was passing by at the same time and decided to wait across the street, without planning anything. He just wanted to see her, to know if she was still the same woman he loved. But she never showed up. And when he saw her leaving a distant building, hand in hand with someone, everything inside him collapsed. It wasn't a hug, it wasn't a kiss. It was the way she looked at that other man. A look he hadn't seen in a long time. A look that had once been his. Daniel didn't approach, didn't shout, didn't cry. He just watched. He watched like someone watching a play end without applause. He returned home in silence, sat on the sofa, and stayed there for hours. No sound, no light, no air. That image burned into his memory as if it had been carved with an iron. The next day, Helena returned home as if nothing had happened. She sat next to him and asked if he wanted to watch a movie. And it was at that moment that he knew their love was over. Because she no longer cared about pretending. And he, in turn, no longer saw the point in continuing to believe. In the days that followed, Daniel withdrew even further. But this time not out of pain, but out of protection. He began to plan his own exit. He didn't want to scream, he didn't want revenge. He wanted to leave with dignity, like someone who understands that you don't fight for someone who's already gone. But first, he needed something. He needed her to know he knew. That he was no longer the lovesick fool she thought she was fooling. He needed to show her, without saying a word, that he was putting an end to it. It was then that he decided what he would do. A dinner. A public place. She would invite a few friends, a few, discreet ones. And there, she would give him the ring she herself had stopped wearing weeks before. But she wouldn't give it to him in person. She asked the waiter to bring the box containing the ring to her table. Everything was planned with a cold, painful, necessary precision. Because some pains require ritual. And there, in front of everyone, she would open the box, see the ring, and understand. She would understand that he knew. That their love had been betrayed. That their marriage had ended, not because of a fight, but because of abandonment. The day arrived. He sat distantly, invisible to her eyes. He watched as she entered with her lover, laughing softly, as if experiencing something forbidden and exciting. He watched how comfortable she sat, as if she didn't carry in her hands the weight of the destruction of a life built together. And then, he saw the waiter approach. The box was delivered. She was surprised, opened it. Her smile fell. Her face contorted in panic. She looked around, searching for him. But he wasn't there. He had already stood. He was already walking outside, his eyes steady, his heart in ruins, but his soul at peace. And in that moment, she knew. And even without a word, everything was said. But what she didn't yet know, was that there was something more. Something Daniel had discovered and kept hidden. A buried secret that would come to light and make everything even more cruel. But that, was yet to come. The muffled sound of the door closing was the only thing Daniel heard as he left the restaurant. The night's chill seemed no stronger than the one he carried in his chest. It was a final silence, a final point firmly placed by someone who had already been beaten too hard by a hope that only he held. There was no going back, nothing more to say. She knew in that moment, with that ring returned before the eyes of others, that the disguise was over. But for him, it wasn't a scene of revenge. It was liberation. He spent the night wandering aimlessly, his hands in his pockets, his gaze lost between streetlights and closed shop windows, his head too full to sleep and his heart light enough not to cry. At home, he sat for hours in the living room, staring at the light in the hallway as if from it some answer to everything he had experienced might emerge. But no answer came. A memory came. And with it, the decision to open that forgotten box on top of the office cabinet, the one Helena had insistently asked him never to touch. Out of respect, he never did. Out of love, he left it untouched for years. Now, finally, he owed nothing to that memory. Inside the box were papers, old photos, loose notes. Her personal belongings, from the time before they met. But it was a small brown notebook with yellowed pages that caught her attention. A diary. One that seemed to have been closed in a hurry, with the pen still marked on the last page, as if whatever was there had been abruptly interrupted. She opened it slowly, inhaling the scent of old paper mixed with faded perfume. The first pages spoke of dreams, insecurities, expectations. They were records of someone trying to understand herself. She skimmed through some passages, feeling a strange tenderness for that old version of Helena. Until, after turning a few pages, she came across the date, a year before they were married. And the words there were different. They weren't sweet. They weren't confusing. They were precise, hard, direct. The handwriting revealed more than the content. Tremors, smudges, erasures. But what was there left? No doubt. It was a detailed account of a choice she made, a choice he never would have imagined. Helena recounted, unvarnished, how she had become involved with another man in the first months of her relationship with Daniel. She recounted how it escalated to the point where she had to choose. And she chose Daniel. Not out of love. But out of fear of being alone. She said, in stark words, that he was safe, stable, predictable. That with him she would have a peaceful life, even if passionless. And that the other man, the man she claimed she couldn't forget, was just a fire consuming her too quickly. She said Daniel would be a good husband. A good father. That with him everything would be easy. But not truly. She married him knowing her heart wasn't whole on that altar. She signed the papers with steady hands, but with a broken soul. And she carried this secret throughout her marriage, like a burden disguised as routine. It was an involuntary confession of cowardice. A betrayal that began even before any vows were made. Daniel read each line as if reading his own sentence. There was no anger. There was disbelief. There was a kind of pain that wasn't just new, but that took on a name and form years after it was planted. All that time, all that dedication, all that loyalty, it was one-sided. He lived a marriage alone. He believed in a story that only he could write. And more than the recent betrayal, it was this revelation that tore him apart. Because now everything made sense. Her distance, the small absences, his effort to maintain something that had already started wrong. Helena had never loved him the way he loved her. She chose him like you choose a safe route on a map. And because of that, she was never whole. She was never real. She spent the night rereading the diary, trying to find a loophole, a doubt, a chance that it had simply been an impulsive outburst. But the coldness of the accounts shattered any illusion. She chose convenience. She accepted being loved without loving in return. She lay beside him every night knowing her presence was a polite lie. And he, blinded by love, built a home on a foundation of deceit. When the sun rose, he already knew what he had to do. There was no more room for dialogue. There was no more reason to seek explanations. It was the end of everything. Not just the marriage. But the image he had of her. Helena showed up 2 days later. She sent a curt message, asking to talk. Daniel replied that she could stop by, but that it would be the last time. When she arrived, her eyes had the expression of someone who hadn't slept in days. She didn't know if he'd seen her, didn't know how much he knew. She sat on the sofa without removing her coat, her body tense, her breathing shallow. Daniel didn't say anything right away. He simply held out the open notebook, one of the pages turned. Helena recognized it. The color drained from her face. She tried to speak, but he held up his hand for silence. He said he would be the one to speak now. And he did. He said the betrayal of the present was already pain enough, but what was inside was confirmation that all the love he believed he lived was an illusion. He said he'd felt inadequate for years without knowing why. And now he knew. He said she'd deceived him from the start, that she'd accepted his gestures, his care, his plans, even though she knew he'd never felt the same. He said loving someone isn't just about being there. It's about choosing to be there completely. And that she never was. Helena wept silently. Her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze lowered, as if every word he said cut her to the core. She tried to justify it, saying she was young, that she was confused, that she thought time would make her love him the way he deserved. But he replied that love isn't an accident. That no one loves by mistake. And that if she'd been honest in the beginning, he would have moved on. I would have found another story. Another truth. He said what hurt most wasn't the recent betrayal, but the lost time. The years given over to fantasy. The nights he believed he was loved, when in reality, he was merely tolerated. Helena tried to get closer. She said she now knew she loved him. That time had given birth to something true. But he looked at her firmly and said he didn't want to be anyone's comfort. That he deserved to be the choice, not the escape. He said he forgave her, yes. But not to get back together. He forgave to free himself. Mostly. And that she would forever carry the memory of the man who truly loved her, while she still searched for what she couldn't even name. Helena stood up without another word. She walked to the door as if leaving a funeral. She looked back one last time, perhaps hoping for a gesture, a word that would reopen the door she herself had closed. But Daniel remained there, standing, silent, whole. For the first time in a long time, he was whole. And when the door closed, he didn't cry. Because there was no more pain. Only the certainty that he had survived. And now, he would start over. But not with her. Deep down, Helena knew. She knew it wasn't about him not wanting her anymore. It was about him not needing her anymore. She, who thought she would always have time, that she would always have a second chance, now realized that some losses are permanent. And the echo of that certainty would be her cruelest punishment. Because there is no greater punishment than losing, by your own choice, the only true love you've ever had. The door closed softly, but the sound was brutal. Helena descended the building stairs without looking back, as if the steps weighed more than her body. Outside, the city continued to spin as if nothing had happened, while she felt something inside had ceased to exist. He walked aimlessly through streets he knew well but that now seemed unfamiliar. His coat was open, his face was pale, and his hands were cold from gripping the steering wheel of the past so tightly that the Mitsubishi was returning. She didn't cry. Not there. Not in front of anyone. But inside, the silence Daniel had left pierced her like a never-ending scream. It wasn't him who was suffering anymore. It was her. For everything he hadn't said, for everything he'd avoided, for all the decisions disguised as insecurity that, deep down, he'd always known were cowardice. The following days passed in a blur. Her phone was silent. The notifications were empty. Mutual friends were distant. Not even her coworkers asked how she was doing. As if everyone had understood something she was just beginning to process. That Daniel hadn't just been a good husband, he had been her only real emotional refuge. And that she had broken with her own hands, not once, but twice. The recent betrayal was a fresh wound, but the true fracture came from much earlier, when she accepted the love of a man knowing she didn't have the courage to return it with the same strength. Not because I couldn't love. But because I chose the easy path, the comfortable, the safe. And then, when the routine began to weigh her down, when her reflection in the mirror no longer meant anything to her, she ran toward what she thought was fire. But it was smoke. Her lover, who used to shower her with promises wrapped in quick caresses and impromptu coffees, now avoided all contact. He didn't answer calls. He replied to messages with monosyllables. In one of these attempts to seek solace, Helena showed up at his workplace. She waited over an hour for him to leave. She greeted him with a shaky, hello. He was surprised but didn't approach. He asked what she was doing there. She, trying to maintain her composure, said they needed to talk. He shook his head, smiled uncomfortably, and said it wasn't the time. That he couldn't expose himself. That theirs had been a situation that had gotten out of hand. Helena frowned, feeling the vertigo of disappointment. Situation, he repeated, as if the word had nails in it. He responded with a sentence that shattered her without raising his voice. I didn't think you would take this so seriously. You're confused. You're holding on to something that was never real. She stood there, on the sidewalk, as he walked away without looking back. This time it wasn't a metaphor. It was literal. Her legs trembled. Her pride crumbled. Shame rose like fire. It wasn't just about losing Daniel. It was about realizing I'd lost him for nothing. For an empty impulse. For a fleeting desire that was now becoming an echo. Helena returned to her apartment, exhausted. He'd locked himself away for days. He wasn't eating. He wasn't responding to messages. He wasn't speaking. She remembered every conversation with Daniel, every gesture, every small act of love that had once seemed mundane to her, but now, in retrospect, were monuments of care she'd never appreciated. He'd had everything and treated it as if it were the least. And now he had nothing. Not himself, not the other, not even a version of herself she could trust. Meanwhile, Daniel no longer lived in the same house. I had decided to change the atmosphere. She moved to a smaller, brighter space. I didn't need much. Just peace. She painted the walls white, changed the curtains, donated the furniture she'd shared. Every detail he erased was part of his liberation. He was back to running in the morning, reading at night. But this time, he was doing it calmly, without the constant shadow of feeling inadequate. Though it still hurt, I had learned to breathe with that pain. It was no longer sharp. It was just a scar. Sometimes, when he passed places they'd shared, a gesture would bring him back. But he wouldn't stop. He knew that looking back would only reflect back who he no longer wanted to be. One afternoon, in a small bookstore where he often went to think, he met someone. It wasn't magical. It wasn't immediate. It was simple. A chance conversation, a shared laugh. Her name was Clara. She had an honest look in her eyes, the kind that doesn't shy away. They talked about books and music and, little by little, about their lives. Daniel didn't tell her everything. But she didn't need to know much to understand that he came from a place where love had been mistreated. And that didn't scare him. She showed him patience, gave him time. And over time, he began to open up. Not out of necessity. But because for the first time, after so much, he felt seen. Without needing to prove anything. Helena, however, couldn't stop thinking about him. She looked for him once more. She waited outside the new address she'd learned from a friend. She didn't insist. She didn't beg. She just wanted to see him. When she saw him leaving, walking with a woman at his side, she understood everything without needing words. He didn't see them holding hands, but he saw them laughing. Quiet laughter. The kind where she could no longer remember how they felt. He hid behind a car, his heart heavy and his eyes filled with what no longer had a place to escape. Daniel let her go. Finally. And not because he didn't love her. But because he understood that loving himself was more urgent than waiting for someone he never knew how to stay. He returned home and, in a final attempt to reconcile himself to his conscience, took out all the letters she had written to him and never sent. He read them one by one, quietly. He faced each word as if it were an ordeal. And he understood that none of these letters could change what had been. Not a single line could rewrite the past. He put everything in a box, the same one where he had found her diary, and closed it tightly. Not like someone who wants to forget. But like someone who decides to live with the memory, but without clinging to the pain. The months passed. Daniel and Clara were already sharing coffee on Sundays, slow walks in the park, comfortable silences. Sometimes they talked about the future. Other times they just sat and watched the world go by. It wasn't a love of fireworks. It was a love that didn't require armor. And Daniel knew that was all he needed now. A place where he could be himself, without fear. Without hiding scars. One day, while reading in the living room, the doorbell rang. It was a delivery. A box with no return address. Upon opening it, he found the letters. A tied ribbon. And a note, I'm not seeking forgiveness. I just needed you to know it still hurts. But now I understand this is mine. Not yours. He read it all calmly. With respect. But not with sadness. Each letter was a reflection of who she was, not of what he had lost. He didn't respond. Not because I had nothing to say. But because it was no longer necessary. The story was over. And he was finally free. In a corner of his house, Daniel placed a final photo in a frame. It wasn't of Helena, it was of himself, on some random beach, laughing in the sun. A reminder that he had survived. Not betrayal. But self-forgetfulness. Because sometimes, the most painful thing is not losing someone. It's losing yourself trying to hold on to what was already broken. But it's also there, precisely at this point of rupture, that the most important reunion is born, the return home within his own body. And this time, he wasn't planning on leaving again. The air was different. Quieter, clearer. It wasn't a change in weather or season, but something much more intimate, the silence left by the absence of what had for so long been emotional noise. Daniel felt that, finally, he could walk without having to look to the side, without needing to guess what was behind every gesture or every word. He was experiencing a new routine, not because of the places or times, but because of the lightness with which he now breathed. That set of letters he received and didn't reply to wasn't forgotten or dismissed with contempt, but stored on a high shelf, where the chapters that one doesn't deny, but no longer needs to read again, were stored. Not out of indifference, but out of respect for the process of having lived them, mourned them, and finally released them. Clara watched him silently when he lost himself in those moments of introspection, as if understanding that, although they shared the present, there were still passages of the past that he needed to traverse alone. I never asked for more than was necessary. He never intruded. And that, far from pushing him apart, brought him even closer. One random afternoon, while chatting about nothing in particular, Clara naturally mentioned an idea that had been lingering in her mind for weeks, a getaway, a short trip away from the city, where they could both disconnect from everything. Daniel accepted without much thought. It wasn't a decision laden with symbolism or a way to escape, but simply a genuine desire to be somewhere else, breathing different air, with company that required no explanation. They packed lightly. Comfortable clothes, a few books, and a desire to plan no more than necessary. The chosen location was simple, a cabin in a small village surrounded by trees, where the only sound was the wind sneaking through the branches and the slight creak of the wood as they stepped on the ground. There, between slow walks and muted conversations, Daniel began to rediscover a kind of peace he couldn't remember feeling before, not because it didn't exist, but because for years he had lived convinced that love was about fighting, sustaining, and resisting. One night, in the warmth of a makeshift campfire, Clara asked him what he valued most now, after everything he'd been through. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire for a few seconds, as if the flames could translate what he still couldn't put into words. Then he said, without drama, that what he valued most was consistency. The ability to look at someone and know that what they say, what they do, and what they feel are all in the same vein. That he no longer wanted to survive on assumptions or settle for emotional crumbs. That he'd learned that true love doesn't require proof, just presence. Clara said nothing. She simply looked at him with a tenderness that needed no expression. And in that moment, Daniel knew he'd found something different. Not better, not worse, just different. Something that wasn't there to repair the past, but to build from a different place. Meanwhile, Helena continued to deal with the debris of her own history. Each day was a small battle against guilt, against regret, against her broken self-image. She was no longer the woman who justified her decisions with phrases like, "I got confused," or "it was an impulse." Now she understood that every act had a weight, a consequence, and that wanting to go back wasn't enough to repair what was broken. She didn't seek excuses, but neither did she abandon herself to punishment. She had started therapy at a friend's suggestion, and in each session she confronted the version of herself she had avoided for years. The one who accepted love without being able to reciprocate. The one who felt empty and chose to be filled by the fire of others. The one who hurt those who least deserved it and, even worse, did so from the comfort of a routine disguised as love. In one of these sessions, the therapist asked if she was still waiting for Daniel to return. Helena answered honestly, no. I didn't expect that anymore. What she wanted was something much more difficult, to forgive herself. Starting over from that place wasn't easy. There was no quick redemption or emotional shortcuts. It involved looking inward and recognizing that, for too long, she'd lived on the run. That her story with Daniel was a refuge she clung to out of fear, and that when that refuge began to show cracks, rather than face her doubts, she chose to shatter it from the outside. She enrolled in an art class, reread frequently, and wrote letters she no longer sent, just to understand herself better. Sometimes he'd go for aimless walks, other times he'd stay home listening to the music they shared. Not as a form of torture, but as a ritual to accept that this story existed and that, although it ended, it also transformed her. I wasn't seeking approval. Just consistency, just like him. Just truth. In the midst of this whole process, one day he received an unexpected invitation. An art exhibition, organized by a cultural association with several acquaintances. I knew Daniel would be there, accompanying Clara, who was participating as a guest artist. He hesitated to attend. He considered it a nuisance, the unnecessary nature of it. But he also thought that to avoid it would mean continuing to run away. And so it was. He arrived late on purpose, hoping the place would already be full, that there would be no room for forced conversation. He walked among the works discreetly, observing each piece carefully, until he saw it. Daniel was on the other side of the room, a drink in hand, smiling as he listened attentively to Clara, who explained details of her work to a small group of visitors. He hadn't seen her yet. But she watched him for a long moment. And in that instant, something inside Helena settled. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't sadness. It was a kind of profound acceptance, an inevitable confirmation. It no longer belonged to her. Not to her, nor to her story. It was his, finally. Daniel, upon seeing her, wasn't upset. He looked at her calmly. He walked toward her with a polite smile and greeted her respectfully. The greeting was brief, without tension, without harshness. A mature exchange between two people who once shared everything and now shared nothing. There were no complaints. There was no nostalgia. Just a strange calm that surrounded them, as if they both understood that the most difficult thing had already happened. They chatted for a few minutes about the event, about Clara's work, about trivialities. When the silence grew long, she looked into his eyes and thanked him. That was all. He nodded. He wished her well. And they said goodbye. That night, when Helena returned home, she felt that for the first time she had closed a cycle without breaking anything. She hadn't received the forgiveness that perhaps some part of her still desired, but she had understood that she no longer needed him. Because what mattered now wasn't that he looked at her differently, but that she could finally look at herself in the mirror without lowering her head. For his part, Daniel didn't mention the encounter with Clara. Not to hide it, but because it was no longer an issue. Because she, the woman who had hurt him, no longer occupied any space in his present. He had learned to live with that history without it dictating his course. Sometimes justice doesn't come in the form of revenge. It comes as peace. It comes when you can say, that was it, without hurting, without burning. It comes when you understand that there are wounds that teach, losses that liberate, and endings that don't mean ruin, but reconstruction. The action was over. The characters had chosen. The pain had been acknowledged, faced, and transformed. There was only one final scene to tell. One that wouldn't speak of revenge or punishment, but of truth. The only one capable of closing a story where love was betrayed, yes, but where it was also reborn. From another place. With brutal honesty. One that, even though it hurt, ended up being the only way to live again. Clara spent most of that morning sitting on the living room floor, scattering canvases and brushes around her, while the light from the window framed her face with a delicacy that seemed intentional. Daniel watched her from a distance, leaning against the doorframe, a discreet smile on his lips, the kind that appears when the soul feels at peace. He said nothing, not for lack of anything to feel, but because he knew the silence there wasn't absence, it was communion. There were days when words seemed unnecessary. Just being there was enough. Since Clara had entered his life, things hadn't gotten easier, they had become truer. And that, for someone who had spent years living with doubts, was worth more than any apparent stability. She wasn't filling a void, she wasn't occupying a space left by another. She was someone who walked alongside him, unhurriedly, undemandingly. Sometimes he wondered if it was truly possible to start over so gently, after everything he had been through. And then I saw her there, distracted by her art, and I understood that yes. That it was possible. Not to forget, but to continue. Later that day, they received an unexpected invitation from a couple of friends to a small, intimate dinner with just a few people. Clara hesitated for a moment, she knew that in these circles, traces of the past could still cross. But Daniel simply smiled and said they were ready. It wasn't about who they might meet, but about who they were now. And indeed, they were ready. They arrived calmly, sat together, and laughed over stories both new and old. When one of Daniel's mutual friends, who also knew Helena, mentioned her name, Clara glanced at him discreetly, as if gauging the temperature of memory. But Daniel simply listened, without reacting. He didn't look away, didn't frown, didn't show any discomfort. It was as if her name no longer belonged to him, as if it were part of a narrative that, though it had marked him, no longer defined who he was. Upon returning home, late at night, Clara spoke softly, as if commenting on the passing of time, "You've changed a lot since that day we met." Daniel looked at her, surprised by the sweetness of her words, and asked what she meant. She replied, "Before, it seemed like you walked with the weight of the world on your shoulders. Now, you breathe as if you finally left something behind." He reflected for a few seconds before answering. He said he hadn't left anything behind, on the contrary, he'd taken everything with him. But now, all that no longer hurt, it was just part of life. And perhaps this was the true sign of healing, when we can remember without losing ourselves again. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, and they drifted in silence until they fell asleep, their hands intertwined on the crumpled sheet, as if holding each other even as they slept. Meanwhile, Helena was experiencing a different kind of silence. More intense, more intimate. She had resumed her routine, with a certain dignity, though her eyes bore that weariness that comes not from the body, but from the soul. After her brief encounter with Daniel at the exhibition, something inside her finally settled. There was no longer the urge to search, nor the illusion of winning him back. What remained now was the understanding that she had lost, not by chance, but by choice. A slow loss, built with small, continuous actions, and confirmed by an abandonment that began within her before materializing externally. She began writing a book. Not about him, nor about herself. But about what happens between the beginning and the end of a relationship. A book that sought neither forgiveness nor justification. Only understanding. She wrote at night, after classes, in a worn notebook, where the ink sometimes ran along with the tears she no longer hid from herself. One of those nights, she received a message from Daniel's mother. It wasn't an attack, nor a demand. It simply said, "I hope you're okay. Sometimes I still think about you. I'm sad about what happened, but I hope you find peace." Helena responded with a lump in her throat, "Thank you. I think about you too. I'm truly sorry." There was no further exchange after that. But that brief conversation was like a mirror that forced her to look at everything more truthfully. Not all bonds are broken with hatred. Some are broken with pain and continue to exist as gentle scars, merely a reminder of what once was and what will never be again. The next day, while teaching, she spoke to her students about literature as a form of redemption. She said that writing was a way to transform what destroys us into something that rebuilds us. And, for the first time, she realized it wasn't just a speech. It was a confession. Across town, Daniel received an offer to participate in a roundtable discussion on emotional architecture, an event about how spaces influence the way we live, love, and feel. He accepted. Not because he wanted to talk about the past, but because he felt he could now use it as a bridge, not a prison. During his speech, he mentioned that the houses we build, real or symbolic, should have windows, not walls. That they need to let in light, even when we fear the brightness. And that the most profound reforms are not those we make to the walls, but to the ways we learn to inhabit ourselves after a loss. He received a warm applause. Clara, sitting in the front row, looked at him with silent pride, without needing to say anything. He stepped down from the stage and walked over to her, took her hand, and for the first time, said out loud, "I'm happy." And he was. A few weeks later, he received one last letter. This time, not from Helena. It was from the publisher who had read the manuscript she had sent. The book's title, What We Didn't Say. The dedication was simple, to the one who loved me, even when I didn't know how to love back. Daniel read each page in silence. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel pity. He simply understood. The book was raw, honest, imperfect. Like her. Like the story they had lived. He didn't know if the world would read it as a work of art, but for him, it was the final straw he still needed. He put the copy on the shelf, next to the books that had most impacted his life. And there it remained. Not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that every story deserves to be told. Even the ones that end. Time went on. Daniel and Clara continued building a solid relationship, made of conscious choices and real presence. They didn't idealize anything, they simply walked together, attentively. Helena finished her book, started another, and began teaching writing workshops for people who needed to transform pain into words. The two, in different ways, had rebuilt themselves. But the scar they shared remained, visible only to those who knew how to look beyond the surface. And although they had already moved on, they both knew, without ever needing to say it again, that story would leave permanent marks. Because some wounds don't heal to disappear, but to teach. What each of them did with what they had experienced, with what they had destroyed or rebuilt, was now the true dilemma. And the answers didn't come easily. They were constructed slowly, in the silence of the nights, in the small gestures of everyday life, in the glances that never left. And it was there, in that emotional complexity, in that dilemma neither of them could erase, that the true story began to unfold. But the end was yet to come. Daniel woke to the soft sound of rain hitting the window. It was early, the sky still carrying that bluish gray of slow-dawning days. Beside him, Clara slept, breathing evenly, her serene face turned to the pillow. He watched her for a few minutes in silence, feeling her presence as confirmation of everything he had patiently rebuilt, healing old wounds with new attitudes. He got up calmly, made coffee for them both, and sat at the table, looking outside, reflecting on how much everything had changed in such a short time. It wasn't just a new beginning for love. It was the reclaiming of a part of himself he had forgotten existed. The part that didn't need to prove its worth, that didn't carry guilt that wasn't its own, that didn't accept crumbs in the name of a feeling that was already dead before it was even buried. He had learned that love shouldn't hurt every day, that constant silence is a kind of abandonment, and that when someone chooses half of us, that half will eventually break. Clara woke up and went to meet him. They sat in silence, as was customary, without the need to embellish their intimacy with unnecessary words. Later that day, as they walked downtown, Clara suggested they check out a small new gallery that had opened the previous week. As they entered, among the paintings and sculptures, Daniel stopped in front of an installation consisting of fragments of mirrors imperfectly glued together, reflecting the faces of anyone looking in various directions, distorted, fragmented, but still recognizable. He approached slowly, staring at his own broken reflection, and in that instant, he understood that there were no more loose pieces inside him. The cracks were there, visible, but not open. They were sealed with experience, with pain and overcoming. When Clara approached and also saw herself in the mirrors, they smiled. There was beauty in the imperfections they now shared together. They no longer needed to hide what they had lived. It was precisely the past that enabled them to live something real in the present. Their love was not naive, it was mature, built with the remains of the previous destruction, but without fear, without comparisons, without the weight of what was left behind. Meanwhile, Helena finally launched her book. It wasn't a grand event, but the room was packed. Friends, colleagues, some former students, people who knew her work but not her story. She was visibly moved. Her voice trembled a little as she thanked them for their support, and when talking about the writing process, she admitted that she had poured out the most difficult parts of herself. She said it wasn't a book about apologies, but about consequences. And that, often, the choices we make trying to protect ourselves end up irreversibly hurting those who loved us most. She received applause, hugs, and sincere praise. But when she returned home alone, she felt the weight of the silence. She sat on the sofa with a glass of wine, looked around, and realized how oversized the apartment seemed. Everything was in place, but still, something was missing. Or maybe it wasn't missing. Maybe that was exactly what was left, the echo of what she had destroyed. For the first time in months, she didn't cry. He simply understood that there are pains that don't disappear, they transform into a kind of discreet presence that reminds us, every day, of what we need to carry. A month later, in a bookstore, she saw a couple from afar browsing photography books. It was Daniel and Clara. They weren't holding hands. They weren't kissing. But the way they looked at each other, the way they leaned in when speaking, said more than any rehearsed gesture. Helena moved away before they saw her. Not out of shame or sadness, but out of respect. She understood, then and there, clearly, that everything that could have been, was no longer. And that wishing for the return of something she herself destroyed would be a kind of selfishness she was no longer willing to bear. For the first time, she felt peace in accepting that the story was over. Not beautifully, but justly. Months passed. Daniel was invited to write an article for an architecture magazine about the relationship between space and emotional memory. He wrote calmly, precisely, symbolically recounting how the environments we live in hold invisible layers of everything we've been. At the end of the text, he concluded with a phrase that conveyed the essence of everything he had learned: you don't have to demolish a house to start over. You just have to learn to open new windows. The article was widely shared, and he was invited to speak about it elsewhere. His voice now reached not only fellow professionals but also people who, like him, carried broken stories and sought refuge in possible new beginnings. Clara accompanied him through each new phase, not as a supporting character, but as an active part of that new life. She was by his side, growing with him, and providing a safe space for his uncertainties. They didn't make grandiose plans for the future. They just lived. One day at a time, with simple truths, with real gestures. There was a silent pact of mutual care between them. They knew they didn't need to promise eternity. It was enough to be present now. Helena, for her part, began traveling more frequently. She participated in literary events, held small artistic residencies, and rediscovered her voice. She was respected in her circle. Listened to. Admired. But never again loved as she once was. And that, deep down, was the most subtle and painful punishment. There was no explicit loneliness, no despair. There was only the awareness that what she had destroyed wasn't just a relationship, it was also the image Daniel held of her. And certain versions of ourselves, once lost in the eyes of those we love, can never be restored. She moved on, yes. She built another life. But in all her achievements, there was a bittersweet taste. A memory that didn't place blame, but taught. And that memory would stay with her forever. In the end, there was no revenge. There was no defeat. There was loss. There was pain. There were choices and their consequences. And for each of them, time brought exactly what they deserved. Daniel found a possible love. Clara found someone who valued her likeness. Helena found her truth, but not the love she had let slip away. And perhaps that is the closest thing to justice life offers. Because sometimes, losing is the only way to understand the value of something that should never have been taken for granted. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, what did you think of this story? Which character touched you the most? Would you have done anything differently? Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Here, stories like this are given a voice, and each episode carries a profound truth. And if there's one thing this story makes clear, it's that betrayal doesn't just destroy a bond. It corrupts love, breaks ties, disfigures memories, and turns affection into silence. Those who betray think they've simply freed themselves, but they forget that, in the same choice, they imprisoned the one they trusted most. True love requires courage, presence, and responsibility. This channel does not support any form of betrayal. Our commitment is to show, through fiction, the real consequences of the choices we make with our hearts, and, especially, with our lack thereof.